Hi, everybody, and welcome to another Horizon Series webinar looking at the big things facing the livestock sector. This is number 13 in a series that has been very well received, and for those who are new to it, please know that all of the previous webinars and white papers are on our website, so feel free to access those. Today is a topic that I think holds a lot of potential for the livestock sector, and that is soil health. There's a lot of looking at soil health in Canada and in Ontario currently, and livestock has a good story to tell on soil health, and I think we need to be telling that story better than we are. Certainly as we head into a new ag policy framework, I think we're at a point in time where there's some real opportunities for livestock to take advantage of that good story. Today we're joined by two speakers. We have Mel Luymes, who's the Executive Director with the Ontario Professional Agri-Contractors Association. And we also have Christine Brown, who's the OMAFRA Field Crop Sustainability Specialist. They'll each speak a little bit and then have some back and forth on livestock and soil health. As we go along, please do have questions and put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And also a reminder that today's webinar does qualify as an OSCIA recognized knowledge sharing event for On-Farm Climate Action Fund applicants. If you have an approved, with an approved project under the nitrogen management category. And for those who fall into that and are interested, we will have a QR code at the end of the presentation so that you can make use of that. So I'm really looking forward to this. I think it's an exciting, important topic, and I'll turn it over to our two speakers.
Thanks, Mike. Happy lunchtime, everyone. And Chris, thanks for starting sharing our presentation. Yeah, my name is Mel Luymes. OPACA, the Ontario Professional Agri-Contractors Association, is one of the newest acronyms in agriculture. And we started in 2017 with a manure-related issue. And really, we represent the farmers that do work for other farmers. So whether that's planting or combining, and about 50% of our members are manure contractors. So, and together we probably spread like 50% of the manure in Ontario would be spread by contractors. So we like talking about manure. And Chris Brown, any more to add? Manure girl herself on our webinar.
Yeah, no, everybody knows what OMAFRA is, and yeah, I work a lot with producers trying to maximize the efficiency of manure, looking at different organic amendments and trying to minimize any environmental impacts. So from there, I'll just go to the next slide.
Yeah. So it all starts with what is soil before we even talk about soil health. And really, we should all know what soil is by now, but we take it for granted, don't we? It's everywhere. But formed over millennia, right? The glaciers deposited here and there, and it's fascinating. And you can see really it is minerals, air, water, and this small percentage of organic matter, which we're going to talk a lot about today. But what's not really in here is just microorganisms and the importance of life in the soil, which is part of organic matter. But I think that's important to talk about. When you think about a teaspoon of soil, there's more microorganisms in that teaspoon of soil than there are people on the earth. So it's really brilliant what's going on underneath our feet. And next slide, Chris. You can't talk about soil health without animals. And my first aha moment was listening to Alan Savory when he talked about how animals are the ones that are, and mob grazing is what reverses desertification in Africa. That counterintuitively, you'd think, oh my goodness, this is precious land. We can't have animals on it. Animals actually build the soil. And that is a virtuous cycle between what they drop and then that fertilizes what they eat. And really, we're not even, there's so much more out there to talk about all the other parts of soil health, like it is minimizing soil disturbance and trying to go no-till and increasing diversity, maintaining cover crops. But all of that really, if you don't have livestock in the system or some sort of manure, it's really hard to build soil health. I'll just put that there. And a lot of people will say, well, I'm organic and I'm vegan. And I always think that doesn't make sense, because if you're organic, the only way to build soil is with animal manure. So then you can't really be a vegan and organic at the same time. Philosophically is my one big beef about that. Just pick one or the other. Anyways, next slide, Chris. This is, we won't get into the carbon cycle too much at all. It's a hot topic too, because of what comes out of animals and its impact on the environment. But I also like to think that carbon is soil's capital. This is carbonomics. It is a natural loop and a cycle, and carbon is pulled back into the soil through plants, and that's fertilized by animal manure. So it just makes this beautiful cycle. It's very sciencey, and I'm not actually a scientist. Chris, was there anything more you wanted to add just about the carbon cycle and how animals play the most critical part of that? We can't overlook that.
Yeah, and one of the things that I like to talk about with soil health is that we're always talking about increasing organic matter, having as high an organic matter level in the soil. And we can't increase the organic matter level in the soil unless we have more carbon going in than carbon going out. And livestock plays such an important role in that. And I think the next slide is really going to show, or next two slides. So one of the projects that the soil team in OMAFRA has been involved in for the last, well, it started before COVID, and COVID kind of slowed it down a little bit, but it was called an Ontario Topsoil Survey. Many of you might have heard of it. And there were randomly, by computer, 250 selected sites across the province. And by random, I mean, some of them turned out to be in the middle of a cemetery. So obviously some of them had to be moved. But those sites represent livestock, they represent crop farms, they represent clay soil, sand soils. So they basically represent everything. And so far, we don't have all the results in yet, but so far, there's a couple of things that have been compared. And so in this slide, we have organic matter where organic amendments have been applied versus where organic amendments have never been applied. So in this, there's no determination of what rates or how often. It's just, have amendments been applied versus haven't they? And what you see in that organic matter comparison is about 0.5%. Now, 0.5%, for those of you not trying to build organic matter, maybe doesn't sound like a lot, but that's huge. It's huge in the amount of time it takes to reduce organic matter by that level, and also by the amount of time it takes to increase it by that level. So this is showing that if you've got that increase in organic matter, you could hold potentially 15,000 gallons per acre more water, so more water holding capacity. And in addition to this, where you've got good organic matter levels, you usually have good earthworms, you've got better infiltration, so also better capacity for the soil to infiltrate that water, so that it's not only holding that water, it's also infiltrating it during those thunderstorms. The other thing with organic matter is it's got higher cation exchange capacity, which means that it can hold nutrients better. And that includes nitrogen. And so when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, that microbial population in the soil has a big role to play in reducing those emissions potentially. So the next slide is indirectly related. So here it's showing organic matter by crop rotation. And so in this case, I guess I'll just make it easy. We're comparing the forages versus no forages, so annual crops versus forage crops. And what we show is that cropping systems with forages in the rotation were found to have approximately 1% more organic matter level than annual crops. And again, 1%, I said 0.5% was huge, 1% is even bigger. And forage fields are generally on livestock farms, probably more predominantly on dairy and beef and sheep rotations than with hogs or poultry, but it does show the impact that diverse rotation has on improving organic matter and improving soil health and adding that carbon back to the soil.
And it also really has all those components that we talked about on that third slide, right? Like for a few years, it's not disturbed, it's got living roots in all the time, and there's manure usually applied to forages. So it's really consistently dairy farms score the highest without even trying.
Yeah.
On some of these top scores for organic matter, for sure.
And it's what makes it really difficult to put a dollar value on organic matter. It would be so nice if we could put a dollar value on organic matter, but a dairy farm that already has good levels is going to have a different value for that organic matter than a processing vegetable rotation that's got poorer soils. And typically when a dairy farmer sells their cattle, doesn't have the manure anymore, generally it's about 8 years. And then they're saying, yeah, you know, I'm really noticing the difference of not having manure. Sometimes it's a bit more, but you do tend to see that difference. Now, it takes a long time for us to see that improvement in organic matter. And so when we do research, when we do field research, and I think it's one of the reasons that researchers that look at nutrients generally just look at fertilizer, because it's hard. Manure adds complexity. But where we're adding manure and organic amendments to improve carbon storage and organic matter levels, it takes more than a couple of years to see those differences. And so in this slide, this is a farm, sandy soil, like tobacco sands. The farmer bought the land and started putting organic amendments on. And then we did some compost trials through a soil and crop project, along with the Compost Council of Canada. And so they were putting the compost on at about 10 tons per acre once in rotation for about a 10-year period. And you can see from the map it's provided by Pioneer, the yellow represents the check strips where no compost was applied during that period. The darkest blue shows where there was a little bit higher rate of compost applied, but you can really see those check strips. And over that 10-year period, really see what difference that adding those organic amendments in combination with cover crops. This farm doesn't have livestock, but does use cover crops and does use diverse rotation. And over those years, sometimes more than others, you see a pretty big yield increase, especially that 2018 corn, where compared to the no compost strips, there was a 27 bushel per acre yield increase. It was a dry year, and that water holding capacity really made a difference in that year for yield. And so one of the other reasons that I put this up is that sometimes farmers that don't have enough manure to cover all their land base find it difficult to put the economics to adding compost or some other organic amendments, but it does show over the long term that there is an economic benefit.
Yeah, it really is a win-win.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
Anything
we have so much we want to get through for you guys.
Well, and the next couple of slides are just pictures, but here's this is from a livestock farm. But in this livestock farm, after wheat, they applied some digestate. So it's a poultry farm. It gets regular manure. It's got pretty high fertility. But on the one side, we had cover crops that had no digestate, and digestate and pig manure are very similar in composition. So it had no digestate. The side on the right, cover crops with digestate. And this is very visual because it shows the impact that the microorganisms have. When we're feeding nutrients to the soil organisms, those soil organisms are active around the root systems of those cover crops. They're benefiting from the photosynthesis that the plants can utilize. And then those microorganisms are giving nutrients back to those plants. And so what we see is an increase in biomass, an increase in the amount of carbon that's going back into the soil. And so this is a very visual demonstration of that graph that Mel had up earlier, showing that carbon cycle.
Yeah, the more greener, like it's just pulling it down. It's 1 + 1 = 5.
I like that better than 1 + 1 = 3.
Yeah.
But it really does show that synergy between having rotation, diverse rotation or cover crops, and especially having root systems over the winter period, so that those microorganisms may not be as active during the winter, but are still actively around those root systems doing still a lot of good.
Yeah, for sure.
And this is just a picture we love.
We love Buck.
Some of you might know Buck Ross. He's very enthusiastic about cover crops. He has a very interesting way of doing it. He puts the red clover down in the wheat, then he comes back in with digestate or with poultry manure, and also adds some turnips and some oilseed radish and some cereal rye or oats, depending on whether he wants overwinter or not.
And,
so
and in this case, Buck is using digestate from the bioen plant. So that's actually like Toronto food waste that's been digested, but there's also manure-based digestate as well.
Yeah, and
we won't even talk about that. That's the next webinar. What is this? Soil your undies?
Yeah. Oops. Yeah, so this is soil your undies. And I thought I had, anyways.
I'm assuming people know what that means, is you're burying 100% cotton, which just so happens to be nicely shaped in underwear. You can see how much is eaten up during the year. But then someone cheeky made it soil your undies hashtag, and it's went around the world.
Yeah, and it's an interesting and fun way to just talk about the impact of those microorganisms in the soil. And so that's the reason it's 100% cotton. And we often talk about the earthworms because the earthworms are easy to see, but the earthworms do have an important role to play, because often those earthworms will be the first organisms that start to break apart the cotton. And then as those cotton are broken into smaller pieces, you've got more surface area for some of those other microorganisms to start impacting. And so what we see here is different rotations and different levels of destroying, breaking apart. I'm not sure what you call it. Wearability of the underwear. So
wearability, I can't say.
Wearability. Yeah.
Yeah, the more it looks like something else. So, but we don't have an actual manure versus non-manure test for the soil your undies test, but that would be interesting. What would you?
Oh, we did at Gore Greens. We had one at
you
Gore
did?
Greens.
Okay, but not on this slide.
No, not on this slide. But the continuous alfalfa hay, I think that one has had manure in the past because it's from a dairy farm. The trouble is I don't know the background of where these ones were buried, because we have buried underwear samples from different sites. But this does show an example, and so where you've got the continuous no-till, continuous corn no-till, you can see that there's the least amount of degradation. Try not to do this too fast. Corn, soybeans with conventional. There's breakdown of that underwear, but it doesn't have the same microbial diversity that you have in a no-till system or in a forage system, and so the breakdown is less than it would be where you're comparing it to a no-till situation. Mm-hmm. And then you can join in anywhere, anytime, Mel.
Oh,
corn, soybeans, wheat, red clover, no-till. Yeah,
and I've seen some where it looks like you just buried them, like they're still even white. So it's interesting how and it's such a cheap test to do, even just to compare. Obviously, like the amount of moisture, and there's so many other variables for your own fields if you're going to do it. But it's a nice side-by-side comparison, the fence row versus the field, or something like that. But yeah, and then it definitely does look like a G-string at this point. So
yeah, just like and if you're doing this on your farm, it's important to put a flag where you put the underwear, because sometimes it can be hard to find.
We hardly found and little bits of it to all put it back together. Yeah. Done it a few years now.
So that's a little bit of the focus on the microbial impact. And there's Andrew Holland and I took a grad level course with Paul Veroni at the University of Guelph. And they're looking at some of the newest research, and some of that newest research is saying we can add all the carbon from cover crops and from crop residues that we want, but it's the microbial populations, breaking those down, and those microbial populations over time that is really impacting that soil organic matter. And there's a lot we don't understand, but it's exciting research, and definitely that livestock component especially with the manure, plays a huge part in that, and with diverse rotations. So on to the next slide, we're going to take a little bit of a different focus. And
yeah, it's more of it's more of the value of, like, if you didn't love manure already, there's other reasons just to love manure, and that's that it can save you a lot of money if you already have manure in your system and you really know how to utilize it effectively. We know how high fertilizer prices are now. This just shows how much it's skyrocketed in the past. So we use these numbers to translate how much would different types of manure actually be valued just for their NPK alone. I think that's on the next slide. I surely hope.
It is. And one of the, excuse me, one of the things that I've often noticed is that when fertilizer prices are high, manure management is better.
Yeah.
It's treated more as a resource. It goes to the fields farther from the storage. You can afford to take it a little bit farther, and it's just in some ways a win-win.
Well, yeah, and you can see how, like, why would manure not be all created equally? Here we've got that digest date that we put that at like the average rate that a farmer would use, and then kind of what is the NPK values and what's the value of that. So you can see poultry manure is by far the most valuable per pound per ton, and so that makes most sense that poultry manure is the most likely to travel furthest away. I think that's important to keep in mind. Yeah, what do these numbers say to you, Chris?
Well, they talk about the difference in different livestock types, and with each livestock type, there's a variety of age groups and types. Like for hogs, for example, that finisher hog manure is a lot more valuable than the sow manure would be, but it shows that there's a value, and there's also a strategy in where is the best place or where is the best time to apply that nutrient. And keep in mind that a lot of this is as applied. So broiler manure is quite a bit drier, higher dry matter content than let's say the hog manure would be. And that makes a difference in that nutrient content, because if we compared it on a dry matter basis, that pig manure would be even more valuable. But we're looking at that value as applied. And then these numbers are also looking at the available nutrients, and the available nutrients really is impacted by how it's managed. So fall applied versus spring applied. Liquid manure, spring applied generally have better availability than solid manure, which has better availability when it's fall applied. There's obviously variations in that as well, but managing and looking at the whole farm for what is my soil type, what are my opportunities, is a big part of that manure management. So
it can range, that's the number I have down there, was for dairy manure, from 45 pounds of N to 85 pounds of N, just based solely on when you applied it, really. So what's the absolute best time to apply a dairy manure to make the most of the nitrogen in it, Chris?
Yeah, and we could spend a whole bunch of time on that. And dairy manure, if it's a very liquid form and most of that nitrogen is in ammonia and it's readily available, and you've got good weather conditions, the spring application is by far going to be the best. But there's the dairy manure, you've got about half organic nitrogen, half ammonium, and you've got a time period in that corn crop where from about that 6th leaf stage to pollination, that corn crop needs a lot of nitrogen. And so how do we ensure that that nitrogen from manure becomes available during that time period when the corn needs it the most? So we can have available nitrogen, but we have to also look at weather conditions for availability. Pig manure applied in the spring, definitely high availability compared to fall application.
It's right away available.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've got to kind of stop here. We've got so much more we could go through, but we want to take a pause for questions.
Yeah, and I'm just going to put this slide up just so that.
People... Well, don't go back. I wanted everyone to guess how much that was worth.
Well, they haven't read the other slide yet.
Well, hope they didn't, because I wanted people to guess in the chat.
And Mel, we often talk about what is manure worth on a per ton or per gallon basis or per 1,000-gallon basis. But it really is important to look at what is in our storage if we were comparing it to a pile of fertilizer from Cargill or Agris or wherever.
Yeah,
Can I go to the next slide now?
No, I think we're done. Jean is on the screen.
Well, no, I don't want to, I hate cutting off a good presentation and good discussion with lots of information. So do a couple more slides, and I'm
Well,
actually not seeing any
Do
questions.
you want to just take a pause? I've seen Peg with a hand up this whole time, so I've been eager to hear if there was any questions, or if anyone wants to just guess, if you didn't see the next slide, how much a full tank of manure worth.
Yeah, that Peg will have to put her question in the Q&A box for us to be able to answer it with the way this webinar is set up. So yeah, I've noticed that as well. So
Please pop them in, or your guesses. Okay, let's just go on, Chris. How much would be in there? We reckon it might be $80,000 worth.
So
That's
is
with the
about
microbes
1 million.
and organic matter.
This is about 1 million gallon storage. So like, this is using our AgriSuite tool of manure production, and then looking at available nutrients from that storage. But 1 million gallons, I don't know if that's typical or not, but it's easy to conceptualize. And if you compared that nitrogen to urea, it'd be about more than 26 tons, almost 27 tons of urea. And at the price that it was last winter, that's about $33,000 worth of nitrogen in that storage. 15 tons of MAP, 25 tons of potash, significant amount of fertilizer in that storage. And how much it's worth depends on how it's managed.
Right. And you said that doesn't, it's really hard to, you said value organic matter. So that's always kind of just a bonus. But I thought this next slide is really interesting too, because if you cover it, even just by covering a manure storage, that's how you make it the most bang for the buck. Yeah, you've just got that same storage as if you covered it, left it uncovered, or if you you covered it and then also had no wash water in it. So you can just have a little moment here staring at all these numbers. I think it's interesting, the cost of transporting extra water.
Yeah, I think that's something that people don't think about when they're building storages. So we've got a liquid storage, and let's say with hog manure, where you've often got dry matter levels in that 2-3%. Well, that means that you're transporting 97% water for the whole duration of that storage. What's the value of that compared to covering that storage in the first place? And especially as we start looking at greenhouse gas emissions and some of the other things, it's going to be valuable to look at when we're building new storages. Do we want that high a content of manure, or sorry, of water in that manure?
Yeah.
And then
yeah, go on. I still want to get through all of our slides if we can.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I do have one question.
What is
kind of
the question, Jean?
Sidetrack you a little bit. This is with International Climate Change Conference now on. There are many voices saying we need to eliminate livestock. You're showing us that we don't. And if you had the podium at that conference for 15 seconds, what would your key message be regarding livestock?
I think it's how we farm makes all the difference. I'm not going to deny that there are issues, but the solution is not getting rid of livestock. We may need to make some modifications to how we do things.
Yeah, and I would say if you take all the forage land, pasture land that's not really suitable for row crops, and you grow the protein sources, which in Ontario would basically be soybeans, you're not going to have any land left to farm because it's all going to be eroded. And so I think that the big picture is sometimes missing. And I think looking at greenhouse gas emissions is important, and there's things we can do. And one of the things that I think is going to be really important is looking at more of the land application that's shown here, where we're applying that manure to growing crops. Because if we've got a slug of nitrogen there in the spring, the chances for nitrous oxide emissions to occur is very high, especially if it's wet and cold conditions. But applying higher organic matter, less water to growing crops, I think is going to be a big part of the solution.
Mhm.
We can't farm without livestock
No,
for the reasons that Mel said earlier.
yeah.
Well, keep moving on, ladies, that we're not
Oh.
getting any questions. I think your information is so great. So
Oh, we're just
Going.
answering the question. No, go back to the land application. Would love to talk a little bit more about that because this is where we can make a lot of the changes. Soil compaction can be a bit of an issue they can get really, really heavy when you're applying manure, those tankers. So getting those deflation systems on the tires, lowering your PSI on the tires is a really good way of reducing soil compaction. So that's something we're already seeing in Ontario. Almost all of our contractors already use CTIS, like the tire inflation systems. Injection is really, it's tough because it's the best place to put the manure is to inject it in the soil, but it takes so much longer to do it. And we're always wanting to get it in, right?
Well, and it also takes more horsepower and more time. And
Yes.
if we're trying to inject manure when the soil's wet, we're actually doing more compaction damage, which is one of the reasons that I'm a really big fan of these toolbars, whether they're called dribble bars or whether they're called trailing shoe systems, depending on what company makes them. But they give a lot of opportunity for in-crop application. You've basically got the same width of application as a sprayer, and you're putting that manure down uniformly in 10-inch strips where the infiltration is quicker. If you've got a crop canopy, you're not losing it. So it's almost the same as injection. And your horsepower requirements and the amount of land that you cover in a day is huge. Plus it's during the growing season. So I think those are because if we have injection in 2.5 foot widths, and we're putting down, let's say 5,000 gallons per acre, that's concentrated as 15,000 gallons in a 6-inch band. I don't think we're reducing, even if it's injected, we're not reducing the amount of nitrogen emissions or nitrogen loss from that, because you can't cover that adequately.
And yeah, and the technology is just getting better every year. Like up in that corner, we're getting on the go, looking at what's the nutrients coming out in that manure. And so we can actually do a nutrient map of what was applied. And that's how you would variable rate your fertilizer on top of that, or, you know what I mean? We can start to get variable rate manure, which is super exciting. And in the bottom corner there, well, one is the drag line. So that's the easiest way of reducing compaction, is don't actually have all the manure on the tanker. But in that bottom on that tanker, I think that's the Vogelsang. Like it's got the dribble boom, but it also has on the front is the Syrian, isn't it?
Siren.
Siren, whatever. It's German, but they're actually putting sulfuric acid in with the manure. How does that work, and how does that reduce the nitrogen emissions?
Well, what they do is they measure the pH on the go, and this is mostly a technology that's used for high pH manures. So some of the hog manures can have a pH close to 8. They want to get that manure pH down to about 6, between 6.5 and 7, to reduce the greenhouse gas, or to the volatilization mostly.
Yeah.
And so adding that sulfuric acid with the manure it provides nitrogen or sulfur at the same time as it benefits the efficiency of that nitrogen, and it's not lost. Because once we get high pH manure, that any of that nitrogen that's in ammonium form basically volatilizes much more quickly than if it's around pH 7, like within 2 hours of application, and mostly when it's warm, good growing condition, so not cold and wet.
So should we be monitoring soil health in Ontario with targets for improvement?
Jean, did you ask that question or someone else? Should we be measuring it with targets in mind? Ooh, it's hard to have a target, that's for sure, because there's so many other factors.
I think the answer is yes, and it doesn't have to be as complicated as as a lot of measurements, but there is some soil health tests like aggregate stability, organic matter levels, respiration.
Soil
like
your
some of
undies?
those tests. Or
Soil
soil
your
your
undies,
undies, yeah.
yes.
Where it would be nice if people had a baseline and looked at how that baseline was improving over time. In some cases, farms that have been doing forage, diverse rotations, manure, it may take longer to see big differences as opposed to sandy soils with long history of cropping without manure. But yeah, I think it's always good to know what your baseline is.
Yeah. Even
Well,
if
we're
it's difficult, we got to do it. Yeah.
It's, yeah, so we're not seeing a lot of questions, but we're headed down to the last few minutes here. Do you guys have anything you want to say to wrap up?
I don't know. What's our next slides, Chris? Was there at least
next
our
slide
contact
was-
information at the very least?
Yeah, it was just showing nitrous oxide emissions and the importance of in-crop application as much as possible. And then we were just going to end on just a little bit on the tools that we have available. We've got AgriSuite, which lets you do if you've got a manure analysis, I think.
Oh,
just go
yeah.
quick.
Click,
So
click,
this
click,
is,
click.
if I've got a manure analysis, I can put in the AgriSuite, my manure type, whether I've got an actual analysis or whether I've got an analysis from the database, just the averages, my application timing, how quickly I'm incorporating, and my application rate. That will give me the amount of nutrients per ton, available nutrients per ton, available nutrients based on the application rate, estimated economic value based on current fertilizer prices, which we can override. And then if we include trace elements, it will also give an estimate of the trace elements that were applied based on that application rate. So this is one of the tools that is very useful for livestock farms. And important, I think it's important to say it with livestock manure and soil health, it's extremely important to test the manure, know what nutrients you're applying, and for maximizing nitrogen efficiency, making sure that you give the credits that are required for that manure so that you're not over applying commercial nitrogen or commercial phosphorus. And then looking at potentially nitrogen side dress test to say, okay, how much more do we need in addition to that manure? And
We've got a question here. Oh, that was our last slide anyways. Hold it there at our contact info, because please get in touch.
We'll put
More about liquid manure, the pros and cons of doing it with liquid. Ooh.
pros and cons of, well,
Do we like liquid manure?
if you like, if you're trying to improve the soil health and you're trying to add carbon, or the solid manure has a lot more organic matter and carbon than liquid manure. The liquid manure, the benefit there is it's kind of like a chocolate bar in that it feeds the soil microorganisms very quickly. And so you get an explosion of the bacterial, but you don't get as much of the fungal unless you've got residue there or some carbon source for them to eat. So from an environmental perspective, from a soil health building perspective, solid manure will do more. From a logistics and economics of storage and all that kind of stuff, there's pros and cons to both.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I need to thank you ladies for participating in this webinar today and the extremely valuable information you have shared.